Welcome to Didactic, Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Edition. I'm your host, Dr. O'Leary, a fellow in child and adolescent psychiatry in the National Capital Region. I started this podcast to help me study for my boards, and I hope it helps you as well with whatever it is you are listening to this podcast for. I need to let you know that everything I say here is my own opinion. Even if I'm quoting something else, if I'm referencing something else, it's also not the opinion of any institution that I work for or will ever work for. Additionally, I use AI to assist me with the content creation. For episodes like this, I use Gemini's deep research tool to produce a detailed overview of pediatric trauma and stressor-related disorders and provide some sources for me to look at. I also look at sources that it doesn't provide. Then I merge content that I create myself with some of the AI content that I think is particularly good. I use my own background knowledge to do this, as well as I spot check to make sure that the facts that the AI is producing are real. And like humans, AI makes mistakes, but I've found more and more that it doesn't make as many mistakes as it used to, and is often as reliable or more reliable than many of the humans that I get information from. This is part 2 of a 3-part series on trauma and stressor-related disorders in pediatric populations. Part 1 was focused on the diagnosis of things like PTSD, acute stress disorder, reactive attachment disorder, and disinhibited social engagement disorders, and I'm going to keep talking about them. I also briefly discussed an adjustment disorder, which is a different kind of stress-related disorder. In this episode, I'm going to touch briefly on the epidemiology of these disorders, with particular attention on PTSD in children, and then I'm going to discuss the kinds of things that might cause or predispose or perpetuate these disorders. In the next episode, I'll talk about treatment. But let's get started with some epidemiology. So the prevalence of trauma exposure really determines the prevalence of PTSD in a population. The prevalence of neglect and pathogenic care really determine the prevalence of reactive attachment disorder and disinhibited social engagement disorder in the population. The prevalence of stress really determines the prevalence of adjustment disorders in the population. So when I give you prevalences, these are only just measurements of that someone did somewhere at a certain time, and they don't reflect what the world will be like in the future or was in the past or really even is right now. So keep that in mind when I'm quoting numbers. I'll start by quoting a number that's about 1/4 of children in the US have witnessed or experienced a traumatic event before reaching the age of 4. And 2/3 of children report experiencing at least one traumatic event by the time they turn 16. Exposure to multiple types of traumatic events is also significant. And about 40% of children and youth in the National Child Traumatic Stress Network have experienced 4 or more distinct types of traumatic events. Trauma histories can be very complex, and in some respects, experiencing trauma predicts experiencing more traumas. But while a large number of children are exposed to trauma and even multiple traumas, a smaller but still substantial percentage go on to develop PTSD. So overall, about 16% of trauma-exposed youth develop PTSD, but these rates are higher for things like interpersonal traumas. So if someone's very close to you, about 1 in 4 will develop significant PTSD symptoms compared to non-interpersonal traumatic events, which is closer to around 10%. The significantly higher risk following interpersonal trauma, things like assault or abuse, suggest that this human element of betrayal or a violation of trust or intentional harm by someone close to you might be a particularly potent factor in the development of PTSD. And this could be due to the profound impact on the core beliefs about safety and trust and the nature of relationships that we have. And so when you're talking about treatments, or when I'm going to talk about treatments in the next episode, we need to keep these sorts of things in mind. In pediatric populations, like in adult populations, girls are more likely than boys to develop PTSD following a trauma exposure. And comorbidity is exceptionally high in pediatric PTSD. So about 80% or 4 out of 5 children and adolescents with PTSD also meet criteria for at least one other mental disorder. And most commonly, this is a depressive disorder or an anxiety disorder, but it could also be a bipolar disorder. And let's not forget about the substance use disorders that often accompany PTSD. So the high level of comorbidity really complicates a diagnostic assessment. So we have to do a comprehensive evaluation beyond just the presenting trauma, and I talked about that in the last episode, to determine what else people have been exposed to and how they might be predisposed to certain things in the future. I'm not going to deeply discuss the epidemiology of things like acute stress disorder or adjustment disorder, except to mention a few things, because I don't think the numbers for these are very reliable at all, or even helpful for a clinician to know, except maybe the numbers in your particular area. Statistically, the current population prevalence of a acute stress disorder is likely much lower than that of PTSD, because PTSD is chronic. It lasts for much longer time, and acute stress disorder converts to PTSD after about 1 month. So over time, the rates of PTSD are going to accumulate in a population, whereas the rates of acute stress disorder depend on recent events. Now, the lifetime incidence, not just the immediate population prevalence of acute stress disorder, is likely much higher than PTSD because acute stress disorder generally precedes PTSD. In fact, in some ways, by definition, it does, except in those cases of PTSD that have a delayed onset. But acute stress disorder does not necessarily develop into PTSD. Now, with regard to adjustment disorders, in my experience, it's already a vastly underdiagnosed disorder because, well, even though it can have a profound impact on someone's life, insurance companies generally won't pay you to treat it. They don't treat it like a disorder that they need to pay you to do much about. Therefore, instead of adjustment disorder with depressed mood or adjustment disorder with anxiety, etc., patients are more likely to get diagnosed with major depressive disorder or generalized anxiety disorder, because this is something clinicians or inpatient units can use to justify billing for services that the person actually needs, but that the insurance company won't pay for if you write down adjustment disorder. So this is all to say that whatever you read about adjustment disorder diagnoses is probably a vast underreporting of its true incidence and prevalence. For things like reactive attachment disorder and disinhibited social engagement disorder, it depends a lot on factors in the society that contribute to early childhood experiences. Right now, reactive attachment disorder is a rare disorder in the general population, and prevalence estimates are typically less than 2%. However, in specific high-risk populations, its prevalence can be much higher. For example, among children who are in foster care or are raised in institutional settings, especially in the past, rates are substantially elevated. So one report indicated that 42% of children removed from their homes and placed in alternative care settings met DSM-4 criteria for some form of behavioral health disorder. And so this population is at high risk for any number of disorders, even reactive attachment disorder. The core etiological factor for reactive attachment disorder is a history of pathogenic care, and that's the same for disinhibited social engagement disorder. So it's the incidence of that care that's going to determine the epidemiology of the disorder. Now I'm going to move on to some of the proposed kind of pathophysiology and neurobiology that affects pediatric trauma disorders. The pathophysiological mechanisms that underlie pediatric trauma disorders have been hypothesized to result from really what's a complex interplay of a lot of things like neuroendocrine, neurochemical, and neuroanatomical factors, and the developmental period in which these happen. So the timing of adverse exposures is critical because there's our sensitive periods when the brain is developing, and that can render a child more vulnerable to long-lasting neurobiological changes. So young children under the age of 5 are experiencing huge amounts of neurological change, and then again, there are critical periods during adolescence where there's a lot of change, and that change can result in things that, if not taken care of at the time, can be much harder to treat. I'm going to focus on PTSD mainly here because that's where most of the research has been done. And a lot of the research has focused on changes in our stress response systems and some of the brain circuits involved in things like threat processing and memory and emotion regulation. One of the things that you'll probably read about a lot if you're searching around for PTSD is something called the hypothalamic-pituitary adrenal axis, or the HPA axis, and how it becomes dysregulated. The initial physiological response to trauma usually includes this surge of catecholamines. So this is adrenaline or epinephrine or norepinephrine. And this happens via the sympathetic nervous system and then the release of cortisol from the adrenal glands. But if you have chronic or repeated trauma, then that can lead to persistent HPA axis dysregulation. In children, this might manifest as upregulation. So there are elevated baseline cortisol levels with greater cortisol reactivity to subsequent stressors. Conversely, there might be downregulation with lower baseline cortisol levels and this real blunted reaction to stress. So you can have a change from upregulated to downregulated, and during the course of the disorder, these can actually change back and forth. For example, a child might be more upregulated based on trauma in earlier childhood, but then when they reach adolescence, it shifts toward more downregulation, where it's actually very hard to get them to react. But in any case, the system is out of whack. We might say it's not in allostasis, which means it's not predicting well the needs of the individual given the cues in their environment. People have also studied neurotransmitters and how they appear to change after trauma. And there are several systems that can be implicated. So for your re-experiencing symptoms, things like intrusive memories, that is thought to be linked to dysregulation in the serotonin system. Disturbances in norepinephrine, dopamine, and GABA have been associated with nightmares in various ways. The avoidance and numbing symptoms, including anhedonia, could result to dopamine deficiencies or overactivation of our endogenous opioid system. Now, the brain's catecholamine system, which in the brain is often norepinephrine but can include dopamine and epinephrine as well, this is crucial for that fight, flight, or freeze response that's activated during the trauma. Prolonged and repeated activation can alter the central nervous system's development and contribute to what has been called like a poorly regulated brainstem. So it could lead to symptoms like emotional lability, impulsivity, anxiety, excessive risk-taking, heightened startle responses, and a lot of difficulty with sleep. Some researchers have noted different brain regions that appear to be implicated in PTSD. The thing you'll hear the most probably is the amygdala, because among its many other jobs, it is also a center for threat detection and fear processing. So it often exhibits a hyperactive response to any threat-related cue in an individual with PTSD. Now, the hippocampus, which is near the amygdala, is crucial for memory formation, for memory consolidation, and also to contextualize those fear memories. And it can be adversely affected in chronic stress, especially with these elevated glucocorticoids, things like cortisol. This leads to reduced neurogenesis, which means not as many neurons are formed, which impairs neuroplasticity. It's much harder for the brain to change the way that it thinks. While hippocampal atrophy is really common in adult PTSD, it's not really found as much in children. Instead, children with a lot of trauma exposure, especially when they are smaller, exhibit smaller overall brain volumes. So, relatively, the hippocampus is about the same size, but actually, everything is smaller. The prefrontal cortex is an area of our brain that's vital for our executive functions. It helps us with our emotional regulation, so it really can help us to inhibit our fear response. And trauma seems to somehow impair the prefrontal cortex's development and function. It weakens its connectivity with other brain regions, especially things like the amygdala and hippocampus. And with this diminished capacity to regulate fear, it just can't do its job. And this is supported by functional imaging studies, especially in adults with PTSD, that shows a lot of hypoactivity in the frontal cortex during tasks in which usually is far more active. There are also genetic and epigenetic factors. So, genetic factors are those factors that are related to what's been encoded in the genes itself, and the epigenetic factors are related to how those different genes are able to be expressed. We also know that PTSD tends to run in families, and this can be because of the genetic factor, but it can also be because of the socioeconomic factors and familial environmental factors. There's a lot of work on generational trauma, which I'm not going to be able to get into today, but it's something worth looking up yourself if you're interested. But another really important factor is the epigenetic factor. So, trauma exposure induces epigenetic changes. And one way it does this is through DNA methylation. In DNA methylation, genes are silenced or their expression is downregulated. Epigenetic changes often lead to long-term alterations in the body's stress response, and this can increase vulnerability to different symptoms of PTSD after a trauma. Also, epigenetic changes can be passed from one generation to another generation. And this means that trauma in a parent can in some ways be passed into the child. So vulnerabilities towards certain types of reactions to trauma through epigenetic changes can be passed on to the next generation. I've talked a lot about physical things like molecules and systems in the body and parts of the brain. But the pathophysiology of things like reactive attachment disorder and disinhibited social engagement disorder are often thought about in a different way. It's generally understood through a lens of attachment theory and the profound impact that severe early environmental deprivation can have on the development of the attachment behavioral system. So, the core etiological factor here is pathogenic care, and it's characterized by social neglect, a consistent lack of opportunity to form stable, selective attachments with caregivers during these critical early developmental periods. During these periods, the absence of consistent, responsive, and nurturing caregiving deprives the infant of the expected environmental input necessary for development of the attachment system and the kinds of behaviors that a healthy attachment promotes. Some of the pioneering observational studies done in this were by Renee Spitz in the mid-20th century. Renee Spitz documented the devastating effects of severe maternal deprivation in institutionalized infants, including profound developmental regression, which means that they just are not at the level at which they should be. They are acting as if they are at a previous level. They often also exhibit a failure to thrive. They just don't grow. They don't seem to eat well. And in some cases, they might even die. And if they do survive, there's often severe emotional blunting. So Spitz coined a term, hospitalism, to describe the severe developmental delays and high mortality rates observed in infants raised in these kinds of institutions that lack adequate social interaction and nurturing. Even though they're getting all of the basic care, they're getting fed, They are given shelter and they're safe. But what they're not getting is good interaction. Spitz also identified something called anaclitic depression, and it's a syndrome of what appears to be grief, apathy, and a decline in development in infants that experience more of a partial emotional deprivation instead of an entire emotional deprivation. And this often happens in infants who are separated from their primary caregiver when they're young. Like reactive attachment disorder, disinhibited social engagement disorder arises from a background of severe early social neglect and deprivation. However, instead of the emotional withdrawal that's characteristic of reactive attachment disorder, disinhibited social engagement disorder manifests as a pattern of just indiscriminate sociability and a lack of appropriate reticence with unfamiliar adults. And what that means is that they'll just approach anyone. They don't seem to ever develop stranger danger. They have no attachment to an individual. It seems like they trust everyone way more than they should. So there's this divergence in behavioral presentation despite a shared etiology between reactive attachment disorder and disinhibited social engagement disorder. So this suggests, well, actually, it proves, it doesn't just suggest, it proves that early neglect does not have a monolithic neurobiological outcome. So the neurobiological research in children exposed to early deprivation identifies things like reductions in gray and white matter volumes that I talked about earlier. So their whole brain, all parts of their brain just seem to be smaller. And there's often disruptions in connectivity between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. So this impairs things like social judgment, regulating their behavior in social environments, and even the ability to distinguish between familiar caregivers and strangers. I have mentioned that the developmental period in which the trauma occurs is vitally important. So I want to spend some time going over the effects of trauma, abuse, and neglect on development at different periods. So let's start with infant development. So this is going to be like 0 to 2 years of age. There's a vulnerability here because there's so much rapid brain development, and there's a complete dependence on caregivers for survival and regulation. So trauma during this stage disrupts what you could call the very foundations of development. In regards to brain development, traumatic experiences lead to changes in the brain's architecture and functional connectivity, overall smaller brain sizes. There's often decreased myelination, and myelination is crucial for fast and efficient neural connectivity. With regard to their physical development, infants exposed to trauma or severe neglect often exhibit this failure to thrive that I mentioned before, but they also have a lot of other symptoms like digestive problems, problems with their sleep. You might notice what appear to be frequent nightmares or just difficulty falling asleep and staying to sleep. They often have feeding difficulties, low weight, and many of them might just die, even though after the trauma they're being provided with care that could keep them alive. Cognitively, especially with things like the use of language, children develop more slowly. So their progress in the cognitive and language milestones are behind. And there might even be a loss of previously acquired developmental achievements. For infants, these are like early vocalizations and simple words. So after traumatic events, they might lose the ability to do things that they did before. Emotionally, traumatized infants are often very irritable, fussy, and easily startled. They're very difficult to soothe, and they may not have any real ability to self-soothe. So when they become upset, they might remain in that state until they just exhaust themselves. Behaviorally, infants might display a reluctance to explore their environment, aggression toward others, or even self-harm. They might be excessively clingy, or conversely, they just might be disengaged from even previous adults that they trusted. They may avoid eye contact, and people might say, "Oh, I think this person is autistic," and they might avoid physical touch. They might fail to seek comfort or hurt even when they're frightened. And then after that, they may not be able to form secure attachment bonds, except in very therapeutic situations. In early childhood, between like 3 to 5 years, so this is like the preschool years, children are developing rapidly in their cognitive, emotional, and social domains. But trauma impedes this progress as well. So, as far as brain development, whatever happened in infancy, if something happened in infancy, continues on, and their brain is not developing at the same rate, and it's smaller often than a normal brain. They still might have large fluctuations in their appetite or in their weight, and a lot of somatic complaints. So, this is when they appear to be complaining about a lot of things going on with their body, and you take them to the doctor and the doctor can't find anything that's actually wrong, and so they spend a lot of time in this period potentially being medicalized. As far as their cognitive and language development, these preschoolers often have difficulties with concentration and focus, so they might be suspected of having ADHD. They have difficulty learning new skills. They may have had some skills and then lost those skills, especially after a trauma in this period. For example, if they are already potty trained or they had very complex speech, if there's a trauma during this period, they might regress into not speaking or having very simple speech. And they might have a pervasive difficulty in trusting other people. Emotionally, they often have a severe lack of self confidence. So they don't have this internal locus of control anymore. They have persistent fear, anxiety, sadness, irritability. So children at this age might struggle even to verbalize their emotions or to regulate their emotions effectively. And this comes out in their behaviors. So temper tantrums can be very frequent and very intense. They may have aggressive behaviors like hitting, kicking, biting others, or even themselves. And they might just scream or cry excessively, and no one can figure out why, or it's just in a response to a very small thing. And then a notable sign in this age period could be a reenactment of traumatic events through their play. They might be playing in a way that involves violence or sexual themes, things that they shouldn't even really know about now. So that's a red flag that needs to be looked into. And like I mentioned before, they might regress into things like bedwetting, or they might start thumb sucking, even though that wasn't a thing before. They may have difficulty making friends, keeping friends. They might just withdraw from social interactions altogether, or they might just indiscriminately approach different groups, but never really be part of the group. Additionally, especially if they're anxious, they might have an extreme fear of being punished. So they might actually be excessively compliant and appear to be a very well behaved child. Now, middle childhood, like between 6 and 12 years, has its own set of things to look for. And this could be because of prior trauma or because of trauma during this period. For their physical health, this includes a lot of those frequently unexplained physical symptoms, and they can talk about them a lot more now. So they might complain of like having a lot of headaches or having a lot of stomach aches. And difficulty with eating is common. So they may be extremely picky about foods, or they may, when they're offered foods, just eat as much as they can and not stop when they're full. Cognitively, they still look a lot like an ADHD kid sometimes. Attention and concentration problems, memory problems. They're not doing well in school. They don't seem to be able to like plan at their level. They may not have an expectation that when others say they're going to do something, that other person is actually going to do it. So they don't act in a way that looks like they kind of trust you to do that thing. Here again, there's often a lot of anger, irritability, social withdrawal. They can have big problems with transitions and fight a lot with their peers and adults, just seem to be kind of oppositional all the time. They just can't regulate their behaviors because they're not sure what's going to happen next. Now, in early middle school, in certain environments, they may actually be exposed to opportunities to use drugs or alcohol and won't necessarily have the ability to regulate themselves and say no. They may, if the trauma was sexual, especially, display a lot of sexual knowledge and behaviors that seem to be beyond their age. Now, in today's world, this can be confounded by their use of the internet. So, if they're able to use the internet and unfettered and can go anywhere, then it might be due to that. Especially getting into middle school, a lot of self injurious behaviors will come out. Things like picking scabs or pulling hair, but more recently, cutting because they may learn about it on social media. These kids will often have a lot of problems making and keeping friends. They'll have a lot of problems with authority, and they may also avoid school. So I'm going to repeat here, and I know I've said it before, but a common theme across a lot of developmental stages, including this middle childhood, is regression to behaviors that were really characteristic of early developmental phases, where they had mastered these things before, but now suddenly they don't have them. And if that's the case, have a high suspicion for trauma. Now, during adolescence, they're really trying to form their identity. They're trying to be more independent, usually, and there's a lot of significant brain maturation happening here. Trauma during these years can disrupt these processes. And one of the things in adolescence that happens that may not be as prevalent in earlier ages is high risk taking behaviors. So they may start to do things that they never had done before that present a high risk to themselves or to other people, especially things like substance use. But also in adolescence, trauma is highly related to the development of other diagnosable mental health disorders, including things like dissociative disorders and psychosis. And that's because this is like the second crucial window of brain development where the impact of trauma can be really unpredictable, complex, and severe. They may have impairments in being able to make a decision. They might become very, very indecisive, or they might become far more impulsive. So they might have trouble with their impulse control. And then they suddenly might have a lot of difficulty with emotional regulation, which they may have anyway, but it's going to be potentially far more pronounced if they experience trauma or have experienced trauma. Here, the brain might start to strengthen neural pathways associated with fear and anxiety and weaken those involved in more complex thinking, things like logic or critical analysis. But it also might try to squash these networks too. And so children might become extremely emotionally unreactive. Here, you'll often see the development of things like eating disorders, insomnia, or even hypersomnia, nightmares, and identifiable dissociative experiences. Things just like spacing out, not being present are very common. Or they might just decide to make drastic and sudden changes to their physical appearance. Kids do this a lot anyway in their adolescence, so you can't necessarily say, hey, you must have experienced a trauma. But if it is especially different from what they were before, like suddenly they're just getting piercings and tattoos, or they have decided to explore a new gender and they never in the past had any inkling of that before, then this might prompt a conversation about, hey, anything going on? You know, is anything happening to you? Has anything happened to you that you wish hadn't happened to you? They might become more hyperactive, distractible, have problems paying attention in school, look a lot like ADHD suddenly developed when it wasn't present before. And then there's a lot of depressive symptoms. They might be helpless, have really low self esteem, a lot of negative self talk. If they were previously outgoing, they might start to appear embarrassed, have a lot of shame, have more anxiety in social situations. And the hard thing about trauma is that, well, they might do all these things anyway because that's what teenagers do. But if the change seems to be extremely abrupt and rather severe, then think trauma. Other behaviors might become more pronounced during this time. So things like hoarding food in their room, a suicide attempt that seemed to come out of nowhere, non-suicidal self-injurious behaviors, running away from home, engaging in unsafe sexual behaviors, becoming very aggressive, somehow becoming involved in the juvenile justice system when that wasn't really so much a thing before, skipping school, declining academic performance, suddenly just dropping out of life. Trauma can lead to a lot of difficulties in relating to peers, forming healthy romantic relationships, interacting with authority figures, and make adolescents more susceptible to negative peer influences. Misery loves company, and they might get more affirmation by being around other people who have experienced things like they've experienced. And so their peer group might change pretty dramatically and rapidly. There is so much that can be said about trauma, in part because there can be so many different reactions to it in different individuals, or different reactions to it in the same individual if it had happened at a different developmental period. So we have to keep all these things in mind when we're thinking about trauma with kids, when we're talking about trauma with kids, when we're trying to relate to them. Initially, this episode was much longer, but I have chopped it down because I could just go on and on and on about different things. But instead, I hope it gave you a lot to think about today, a lot to question yourself, and inspired you to take a deeper look into it. The next episode is going to go into some of the ways that we treat trauma based on some of the perspectives on trauma that I have shared today. But until then, thanks for listening. I am Dr. O'Leary, and this has been an episode of Didactic Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Edition. Nothing in this podcast should be considered personal, medical, or mental health advice.